Late one Friday evening, Clara scrolled aimlessly through Craigslist. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time before bed. As she clicked through the usual assortment of job listings, furniture sales, and community events, an ad caught her eye. Free antiques, first come, first served. The post was unusually sparse. No photos, just a brief description. Clearing out my late grandmother's estate. All items must go. Rare finds, beautiful craftsmanship, address listed below. Tonight only. Clara hesitated. She'd always had a thing for antiques, and free was hard to ignore. The address wasn't far, just on the edge of town. She figured she'd swing by and take a look. She grabbed her keys, threw on a jacket, and headed out. The house stood in an overgrown lot, barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering porch light. Its weathered facade looked forgotten, almost sinking into the surrounding trees. Clara parked her car on the gravel driveway, the crunching sound breaking the heavy silence. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She waited, knocked again. Still nothing. Just as she considered leaving, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. A handwritten note taped to the inside of the door caught her eye. "Items in the basement. Take what you want." Clara's instincts told her to leave. The whole setup felt off, but curiosity overpowered her caution. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floor. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. She found the basement door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing a steep staircase plunging into darkness. Pulling out her phone, she turned on the flashlight and began her descent. The stairs groaned under her weight, each step amplifying the eerie quiet. At the bottom, the beam of her flashlight swept across the room. It was cluttered with furniture, dusty knickknacks, and ornate trinkets. Clara's apprehension began to fade. The pieces were beautiful. Mahogany tables, gilded mirrors, porcelain figurines. She reached for a small carved jewelry box, admiring its intricate design. Then she heard it. A faint rustling, like fabric dragging across the floor. She froze, scanning the room. Nothing moved. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. But just as she turned back to the jewelry box, she heard it again. Closer this time. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A faint laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the basement. Low, guttural, and distinctly inhuman. The hair on her neck stood up. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a shadow dart across the far wall. Panicked, she turned and bolted up the stairs. But as she reached the top, the basement door slammed shut in her face. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A scratching sound started from the other side, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. The light on her phone began to dim, though the battery was full when she'd arrived. From behind her came a low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. She turned her head ever so slightly, just enough to see. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, emaciated shape with skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth a gaping void filled with jagged teeth. It moved unnaturally, each step a grotesque jolt, as though its limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. Clara screamed and threw herself at the door, pounding on it with both fists. The scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door creaked open, and Clara stumbled out, nearly colliding with a man standing in the hallway. He was gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a thin, crooked smile. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice a chilling monotone. Clara didn't answer. She sprinted past him, through the house, and out the front door. She didn't stop running until she was back in her car. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing on the porch, watching her. Behind him, in the doorway, the figure loomed, its hollow eyes locked on her. When she got home, Clara slammed the door and locked it, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but when she opened Craigslist to find the address again, the post was gone. She never went back. But every so often, when she was alone at night, she swore she could hear faint scratching on her walls, followed by a low, guttural laugh. Jack had been driving for hours. His part-time gig as a Craigslist delivery driver wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The idea was simple. Pick up items people sold online and deliver them to buyers who didn't want to make the trip themselves. Most nights were uneventful, just him, his van, and a playlist of true crime podcasts. This night started no differently. Around 9 p.m., Jack received a request. The listing read, wooden crib, handmade, excellent condition, free. The buyer wanted it delivered immediately. Jack hesitated. It was late, and the pickup address was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. But the buyer had offered a generous tip. Against his better judgment, Jack accepted. The GPS led him down increasingly narrow roads until it spat him out on a dirt path surrounded by dense forest. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness. Finally, he spotted a house, if it could even be called that. The structure was crumbling, the roof sagging under the weight of neglect. A single light flickered in the front window. Jack parked, leaving the engine running, and approached the door. He knocked. The sound echoed, unnaturally loud in the stillness. Moments later, the door creaked open. A man stood there, gaunt and pale, his face partially hidden by shadow. "You're here for the crib," the man said, his voice raspy and strained. "Yeah. Where is it?" Jack asked, glancing past the man into the darkened interior. The man stepped aside, revealing a narrow hallway. "In the back. Take it and go." Jack hesitated. Something about the man felt off, his unblinking stare, the way his thin frame seemed to barely hold him upright. But Jack just wanted to get the job done. He stepped inside. The hallway was lined with faded photographs. Most were too damaged to make out, but one caught Jack's eye. It showed a family, a man, woman, and baby. The woman's face was scratched out, and the baby's eyes had been crudely blacked over with a marker. Jack swallowed hard and kept walking. The house smelled of damp wood and something metallic. He reached the back room where the crib sat in the center, illuminated by the weak glow of a bare light bulb. The crib was beautiful, intricately carved with swirling patterns and delicate designs. But something about it made Jack uneasy. The carvings didn't seem random. They looked like faces, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. He reached out to lift the crib when he felt it, a sharp, icy chill that crept up his spine. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible in the cold air. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, a chorus of voices overlapping, each filled with anguish. Jack spun around, his flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. The whispers turned to laughter, childlike, but wrong. It echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder until Jack clapped his hands over his ears. "Take it," a voice growled behind him. Jack whipped around. The man was standing in the doorway, his face inches from Jack's. His eyes were sunken, his pupils like black voids. "Take it, and leave." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the crib, dragging it down the hallway. As he passed the photographs, he noticed something horrifying. The scratched-out faces and blacked-over eyes now stared directly at him, their expressions twisted with rage. He burst out the front door and threw the crib into the back of his van. He didn't even bother strapping it down before slamming the door and peeling out of the driveway. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his heart pounding. But as the adrenaline faded, a new sensation crept in, the feeling of being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The crib had moved. It now sat upright in the middle of the van, and in its shadowy confines, something shifted. Two small hands reached up over the edge. Jack swerved, nearly running off the road. When he looked again, the crib was empty. Panicking, he pulled over, jumped out, and opened the van's back doors. The crib sat motionless, exactly as he had placed it. He stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the buyer. "Where are you? Bring it inside." Jack looked at the delivery address. It wasn't far, just a few miles up the road. He considered abandoning the job, but decided against it. The quicker he got rid of the crib, the better. The delivery address led him to a desolate house surrounded by overgrown grass. Jack carried the crib to the front door, desperate to be done. Before he could knock, the door swung open. An elderly woman stood there, her eyes wide with panic. "Why would you bring that here?" she hissed. "What are you talking about? You ordered this," Jack stammered. She shook her head. "I didn't. No one did. They follow whoever takes it. You have to get rid of it. Burn it. Now." Before Jack could respond, the door slammed shut, leaving him alone in the dark. A soft giggle floated through the night air, coming from the crib. Jack never made another delivery. Emma had been searching for a roommate for weeks. The rent on her two-bedroom apartment was becoming unmanageable, and Craigslist seemed like the quickest solution. After sorting through dozens of vague or downright bizarre replies, one email caught her attention. "Hi, Emma. I saw your ad and think we'd be a great fit. I'm clean, quiet, and work night shifts, so you'll barely notice I'm around. I can move in right away. Let me know." Straightforward and polite. She replied, and within the day, Chris confirmed. No long interviews, no awkward meetings. It was almost too easy. The following weekend, Chris arrived. Emma was surprised to find that Chris was a woman, a petite, quiet brunette with tired eyes and an air of nervousness. She carried only a single duffel bag and didn't ask for help unpacking. They exchanged pleasantries, and Chris immediately retreated to her room. Emma chalked it up to nerves. The first night uneventfully, but by the second night, Emma began noticing odd things. At around 3 a.m., she woke to faint sounds coming from the kitchen, whispering, low and rapid, as though someone were arguing with themselves. She tiptoed down the hall, calling out softly, "Chris?" The whispering stopped. The kitchen was empty. The next morning, Emma mentioned the incident. Chris laughed nervously. "Sorry, I talk to myself sometimes. Bad habit." But Emma wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, more strange occurrences piled up. Small items, keys, a coffee mug, her favorite pair of earrings, would vanish, only to reappear in odd places. Doors Emma swore she had locked were left ajar, and every night the whispering returned, growing louder and more frantic. One evening, Emma decided to stay awake and wait. She sat in the darkened living room, listening. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the whispers began. They came from Chris's room this time, muffled but insistent. Emma crept down the hall, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear to the door. The whispers were clearer now, multiple voices overlapping, each one angry and desperate. But something was wrong. The voices weren't Chris's. Then came a knock. Not on the door she was standing at, but on her bedroom door behind her. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The apartment was silent. Panicking, she burst into Chris's room, only to find it empty. The bed was untouched, the duffel bag gone. It was as if Chris had never moved in. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. It was an email from Chris. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have stayed. It's not safe. Don't let it in." Emma stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. A creaking sound drew her attention back to the room. The closet door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness spilling into the dim light. She stepped closer, every instinct screaming at her to run. A faint whisper floated out, "Let me in." Emma backed away, slamming the door and locking herself in her bedroom. She didn't sleep that night, her ears straining for the faintest sound. By morning, she'd packed her belongings and left the apartment for good. Weeks later, she revisited the Craigslist post, hoping for answers. To her shock, it was still active, as though no one had ever replied. The title read, "Looking for a roommate, rent negotiable, room already furnished, move in today." The photo attached showed her apartment, but something was off. In the window, just behind the glass, a pale face stared back. Mia was an aspiring model trying to build her portfolio without breaking the bank. Craigslist was her go-to for finding freelance photographers offering free shoots. One evening, she found an ad titled "Looking for New Models, Free Portfolio Sessions." The photographer, calling himself Alan, claimed to have years of experience and even offered a link to a sleek, professional-looking website. After exchanging a few emails, Mia agreed to meet Alan at his studio. The location was in an old industrial district, a converted warehouse surrounded by crumbling buildings. The place looked run down, but the inside was surprisingly well kept. Alan greeted her warmly. He was tall and lanky, with a kind face and a soft, almost shy demeanor. The studio was filled with professional equipment, tripods, softboxes, and backdrops in every color. It put her at ease. The shoot started smoothly. Alan gave clear directions, complimenting her poses and capturing dozens of shots. He asked her to try different outfits she'd brought, and everything felt professional, if a little intense. But as the session went on, something shifted. Alan's compliments became less about her poses and more about her. "You're beautiful," he murmured, almost to himself. "So perfect." Mia laughed nervously, brushing it off. But then, as she changed behind a divider, she caught a glimpse of his shadow lingering on the other side. "Everything okay, Alan?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just adjusting the lights," he replied, though she didn't hear any equipment moving. When she stepped out, his demeanor was different, more serious, almost predatory. He asked her to pose in ways that felt increasingly uncomfortable. When she hesitated, he'd insist, "It's for the art, trust me." Mia's unease grew. She decided to end the session early, making up an excuse about needing to be somewhere. Alan didn't argue. He simply smiled and handed her a USB drive. "Here are the photos so far," he said. She thanked him, grabbed her bag, and left, her heart racing. At home, Mia plugged in the USB to review the pictures. At first, they were just as she remembered, standard modeling shots. But as she scrolled further, her stomach dropped. There were photos she didn't remember posing for. Shots of her changing behind the divider, her body partially exposed. Close-ups of her face with an expression of fear she didn't recall making. And worse, candid shots of her walking into the studio, unaware she was being photographed. Her hands trembled as she scrolled to the last file, a video. She hesitated, then clicked play. The footage was shaky, taken from a hidden camera. It showed her leaving the studio and walking to her car. Then it cut to later that night, a shot of her apartment building, her window. Mia's blood ran cold. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was an email from Alan. "Did you like the photos? You're even more stunning when you don't know I'm watching." Panic set in. She called the police, but there was little they could do without proof that Alan had actually done anything illegal. They advised her to change her locks and stay elsewhere for a while. That night, Mia stayed at a friend's apartment, but as she tried to sleep, her phone buzzed again. Another email. "You shouldn't have left. You were perfect right where you were." Attached was a photo. It showed her through her friend's living room window, asleep on the couch. Mia never returned to modeling. And Alan? He disappeared. His Craigslist ad replaced weeks later by another one, looking for new models, free portfolio sessions. Daniel had just moved into a new apartment and was trying to furnish it on a tight budget. Scrolling through Craigslist, he found a post that seemed perfect. Free couch, excellent condition, moving ASAP, first come, first served. The couch in the photo was surprisingly nice, plush, gray, and modern. It looked too good to be free. The post's description was brief, just an address and a note saying the owners wouldn't be home, but the couch would be left out front. Daniel didn't think twice. He grabbed his truck and headed to the address, a small suburban house at the edge of town. True to the ad, the couch was waiting on the curb. It looked exactly like the photo, and apart from a faint musty smell, it seemed in great shape. He loaded it into his truck and brought it back to his apartment. That evening, Daniel settled onto the couch with a beer and his laptop. But as the hours passed, an uneasiness crept over him. It started subtly, a strange draft in the room, the faint sound of creaking, even though he was perfectly still. He told himself it was just the building settling. But then he noticed something stranger. The musty smell wasn't going away. In fact, it was growing stronger, almost like wet earth mixed with decay. Frustrated, Daniel decided to inspect the couch more closely. As he lifted the cushions, he found nothing unusual. But when he flipped the couch over, his stomach lurched. The underside was torn and crudely stitched back together, as if someone had hastily tried to repair it. Curiosity overtook him. He grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut the stitching open. The smell hit him immediately, overpowering and foul. Daniel gagged, covering his nose as he pulled the fabric apart to reveal what was inside. A dark, matted mass of hair spilled out, tangled with dirt and something sticky. Among the clumps, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A cracked, yellowed fingernail still attached to a decayed piece of flesh. Heart-pounding, Daniel shoved the couch away from him, staring at the grotesque discovery. He grabbed his phone to call the police, but froze when a notification popped up. It was an email from an address he didn't recognize. "You found it. It's yours now." Daniel stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Before he could react, the power in his apartment went out, plunging the room into darkness. From the corner where the couch sat, he heard a soft, wet, dragging sound. It started faintly, but grew louder, as though something heavy was shifting beneath the fabric. Daniel stumbled backward, his phone's flashlight shaking as he aimed it toward the couch. The cushions were moving, slowly, deliberately, as though something underneath was pushing against them. And then, it stopped. For a moment, the apartment was silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing. He backed toward the door, his hand fumbling for the knob. Just as he turned it, the couch groaned, the sound of springs creaking and snapping under pressure. A figure emerged, dragging itself out from beneath the torn fabric. It was emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, and its empty eye sockets stared directly at him. A chilling, guttural whisper escaped its cracked lips. "Stay!" Daniel didn't look back. He bolted out of the apartment, running until his lungs burned. He never returned, leaving his possessions behind, including the couch. Weeks later, a new Craigslist ad appeared. Free couch, excellent condition, moving ASAP, first come, first served. The photo showed a plush, gray, modern couch. The description was brief. Don't miss out. Lila was a college student trying to make some extra money. One night, while browsing Craigslist, she came across a listing. Urgently seeking babysitter. Tonight only. Generous pay. The ad was brief, but the payment offered was triple her usual rate, so she couldn't resist. She sent a quick reply and got an immediate response from a woman named Mrs. Harper. "Thank you for replying so quickly. It's for my son Sam. He's already asleep, so you won't have much to do. Just keep an eye on him until we're back around midnight." Mrs. Harper provided an address that was only a few neighborhoods away. Lila grabbed her bag and headed out. The house was an old Victorian tucked at the end of a long, unlit street. The porch light flickered as Lila approached. Before she could knock, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Harper, a pale, thin woman with tired eyes. "Thank you so much for coming on such short notice," Mrs. Harper said, ushering her inside. The house felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed too heavy for a home. "Sam is upstairs in his room," Mrs. Harper explained. "He's already asleep, so you shouldn't have any trouble. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. We'll be back in a few hours." Before Lila could ask any questions, Mrs. Harper grabbed her coat, muttered a rushed goodbye, and disappeared out the door. Alone now, Lila took a quick look around the house. The decor was outdated, faded wallpaper, antique furniture, and old photographs lining the walls. All the photos were of a boy, presumably Sam, but his face was always slightly blurry, as though the camera hadn't focused properly. Shrugging off the odd vibe, Lila settled on the couch with her laptop. The night was uneventful at first, but around 10 p.m. the baby monitor on the coffee table crackled to life. A soft whisper came through the static. Lila froze, her eyes fixed on the monitor. The whisper grew louder, though she couldn't make out the words. "Sam?" she called hesitantly. No response. Grabbing her phone, Lila made her way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light spilling out from a partially open door at the end. That had to be Sam's room. She pushed the door open gently. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed against the wall. A lump under the covers indicated Sam was still asleep. Relieved, Lila stepped closer. "Sam?" she whispered. The lump didn't move. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the blanket back. There was nothing under it. Her stomach dropped. She spun around, scanning the room, when she noticed something chilling. In the corner, facing the wall, stood a figure, small and still. "Sam?" she asked again, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Heart pounding, she stepped closer. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched his shoulder. The moment she did, the figure turned sharply. It wasn't a boy. It wasn't human. The thing had hollow, black eyes and a face stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Its head tilted, the smile growing impossibly wider as it let out a high-pitched giggle. Lila stumbled backward, falling against the bed. The thing lunged toward her, but before it could reach her, the room plunged into darkness. Lila scrambled to her feet and bolted downstairs. Grabbing her bag, she ran out of the house and into the night. When she reached her car, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Harper. "Thank you for watching, Sam. You should have stayed longer." The next day, shaken but curious, Lila searched for the address online. What she found left her paralyzed with fear. The house had been abandoned for years. Its last occupants, a woman and her young son, had died tragically in a fire. The boy's name? Sam. Weeks later, another ad appeared on Craigslist, urgently seeking babysitter tonight only, generous pay. Victor was desperate for a place to live. After losing his job and struggling to pay rent, he turned to Craigslist, hoping to find something cheap and immediate. One ad caught his eye. Room for rent, $200 per month. Utilities included. Quiet tenant preferred. The price was absurdly low, but Victor couldn't afford to be picky. He contacted the poster, a man named Mr. Lang, who responded almost immediately. "Come by tonight if you're interested. Bring cash for the first month, and it's yours." The address was in an older part of town where rows of decaying brownstones loomed like forgotten relics. When Victor arrived, the building was eerily silent, with only a dim bulb flickering above the front door. Mr. Lang greeted him, a wiry, middle-aged man with sunken eyes and a toothy grin. "Come in," Lang said, his voice low and gravelly. The inside of the house was barren. The walls were stripped of paint, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Mr. Lang led Victor upstairs to a small room at the end of a narrow hallway. "This is it," Lang said, gesturing to the room. "No pets, no loud music. You stay in your room at night. Those are the rules." Victor didn't care. The rent was a steal. He handed over the cash, and by nightfall he was moving in. That first night, Victor unpacked his meager belongings and tried to settle in. The room was small but adequate, just a bed, a desk, and a single window that looked out onto a crumbling brick wall. At around 11 p.m., as Victor lay in bed scrolling on his phone, he heard it, a faint scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from the walls. At first he dismissed it as rats or the creaking of an old building. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. Victor sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out. The scratching stopped. Moments later, there was a soft knock at his door. "Mr. Lang?" Victor asked, but there was no response. He got up, hesitantly opened the door, and peered into the hallway. It was empty. Shaking it off, he returned to bed, but the unease lingered. The next morning, Victor decided to ask Lang about the strange noises. "Probably just the pipes," Lang said dismissively. But his tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. That night, the noises returned, louder this time. The scratching came from inside the walls, followed by faint whispers. Victor pressed his ear against the wall, straining to make out the words. "Help! Me!" Victor jerked back, his blood running cold. He grabbed his phone, intending to leave, but before he could dial anyone, the whispering stopped. The room fell unnervingly silent. Then, from under the bed, came the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. Victor froze. He stared at the bed, every instinct screaming at him to run. Summoning his courage, he dropped to his knees and lifted the bed skirt. There was nothing there. But as he stood, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Spinning around, he saw it, a pale face peering at him from the corner of the room. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, teeth glinting in the dim light. Victor stumbled backward, tripping over the bed and crashing to the floor. When he looked up, the face was gone. He didn't sleep that night, keeping every light in the room on and clutching a heavy lamp for protection. By morning, he was ready to leave. He packed his bag and headed for the door, only to find it locked from the outside. Panicking, he pounded on the door. "Lang! Let me out!" The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, but no one was there. Victor bolted, not looking back. Days later, he searched Craigslist, hoping to find a new place to stay. To his horror, he saw an ad that looked all too familiar. Room for rent, $200 per month, utilities included, quiet, tenant preferred. The address was the same, and in the corner of the photo, just barely visible in the shadowed room, was a pale face staring back. Kevin was a delivery driver who made extra cash by picking up odd jobs through Craigslist. One night, he found an ad that intrigued him. Urgent delivery needed, $500 cash, no questions asked. The instructions were simple. Pick up a package at a remote address and deliver it to another location by midnight. Kevin, desperate for cash, responded to the ad and got a quick reply. "Thank you for helping. Come to 46 Elmwood Lane at 10 p.m. The package will be waiting on the porch. Just take it and go." The address was over an hour away in a part of town Kevin wasn't familiar with. Still, $500 was worth the late-night drive. He arrived at 10 p.m. sharp. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up and the paint was peeling off the walls. True to the ad, a package sat on the porch, a small, square box wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. Kevin hesitated. The whole setup felt off. But $500 was $500. He grabbed the package, loaded it into his car, and started the drive to the delivery address. The road was dark and winding, with no streetlights. As he drove, Kevin's unease grew. The package seemed heavier than it should have been for its size. Every bump in the road made it shift, and he swore he heard something inside, like a faint scraping or shuffling. Halfway through the trip, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Do not open it." Kevin's stomach knotted. He hadn't even considered opening the package, but now the thought was inescapable. Who had sent the text? How did they have his number? As the minutes dragged on, the strange noises from the box grew louder. Thumps, faint scratching, and what sounded like a muffled whimper. Kevin pulled over, his curiosity overwhelming his fear. He got out of the car, grabbed the package, and set it on the hood. The moonlight cast an eerie glow as he carefully untied the twine. The second he loosened the paper, the scratching stopped. Kevin hesitated, his hands trembling, before peeling back the wrapping. Inside was a plain wooden box with no hinges or lid, just a small, round hole at the top. It looked old, almost ancient, with strange symbols carved into its surface. As he leaned closer, he thought he heard faint whispers coming from the hole, like voices overlapping in an unintelligible chant. Then the box moved. Kevin stumbled back, nearly dropping it. The whispers grew louder, filling the night air. Panicked, he wrapped the box back in the paper, tied it hastily with the twine, and shoved it back into his car. He didn't care about the money anymore, he just wanted to get rid of it. The delivery address was a run-down warehouse on the outskirts of town. Kevin arrived just before midnight. The place was completely dark except for a single light above a steel door. He approached cautiously, the package tucked under his arm. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, revealing a man in a dark suit. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and empty of emotion. "You have it?" the man asked, his voice cold and flat. Kevin handed over the package without a word. The man inspected it, then gave a brief nod. "Your payment is in the car," he said, stepping back into the shadows. Kevin hurried back to his car, eager to leave. Sure enough, there was an envelope on the passenger seat, filled with crisp $100 bills. But as he started the engine, he noticed something horrifying in the rearview mirror. The man in the suit was standing in the distance, holding the unwrapped box. He wasn't alone. Behind him were dozens of shadowy figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and they were all staring at Kevin. His engine roared to life, and he sped off, not daring to look back. That night, Kevin swore he'd never take another Craigslist job again. But a week later, he received a text from an unknown number. Another delivery, $1,000, same rules. Attached was a photo of a package. It was already sitting on his porch. Emily loved animals. She was a college student with a passion for furry companions, so pet-sitting gigs on Craigslist were her favorite way to make extra money. One day, she stumbled upon an ad that seemed too good to be true. Pet sitter needed for the weekend, $800, low-maintenance dog. The offer was irresistible. The ad described a well-behaved dog named Max and promised minimal effort, just feeding, a couple of walks, and keeping him company. Emily immediately responded. The owner, a man named Mr. Dyer, replied almost instantly. "Thank you, Emily. Max is very sweet. I'll be out of town, but you'll have the whole house to yourself. I've left everything you'll need." He gave her an address on the outskirts of town. It was a little far, but for $800, she didn't mind. When Emily arrived, the house was a large, gloomy Victorian surrounded by overgrown bushes. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. On the porch sat a tall man in a trench coat. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and waxy. "You must be Emily," he said, smiling faintly. "Thank you for helping. Max is in the living room. Please don't go into the basement. Everything else is fine." The "don't go into the basement" comment sent a shiver down her spine, but she nodded. Mr. Dyer handed her the keys, muttered a rushed goodbye, and disappeared into the night. Inside, the house was dimly lit and smelled of mildew. Max was sitting in the living room, a massive black dog with piercing yellow eyes. He didn't bark or wag his tail when Emily approached, just stared at her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Hey, buddy," she said, kneeling to pet him. His fur was rough, almost bristly, and his body felt unnaturally cold. That night, as Emily tried to sleep on the living room couch, strange noises echoed through the house. The sound of scratching, slow, deliberate, came from somewhere below, the basement. Emily ignored it at first, but as the hours dragged on, the scratching grew louder, joined by faint thuds like something heavy dragging across the floor. Max sat upright in the corner, his glowing eyes fixed on the basement door. "It's probably just the pipes," Emily muttered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. The next day, she took Max for a walk. Despite his intimidating appearance, he didn't pull on the leash or bark at other animals. But the longer she spent with him, the more she noticed his odd behavior. Max didn't seem interested in food or water. He never wagged his tail or even blinked. And when a neighbor waved to her, Max growled, low and guttural, almost human-like. That night, the noises from the basement returned, louder and more insistent. Emily tried to ignore them, but curiosity gnawed at her. Against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, she approached the basement door. Max followed closely, his yellow eyes glowing in the dark. "Stay here," she whispered, but Max didn't move. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into pitch-black darkness. The smell hit her first, rotting meat and damp earth. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Step by step, she descended, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, she found a room filled with strange, ritualistic markings on the walls and floor. Candles, long burned out, lined the shelves. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate, its lid cracked open. The inside was smeared with dark, dried stains, and scratch marks gouged deep into the wood. Emily's stomach turned. She spun around to leave, but froze when she heard the basement door slam shut. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her. "Max?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the faint light from the living room. But something was wrong. His body began to shift and contort, his limbs elongating unnaturally, his fur receding to reveal pale, stretched skin. Emily screamed as the creature descended the stairs, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto her. The last thing she saw before the flashlight shattered was its mouth, stretching impossibly wide, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Days later, a new ad appeared on Craigslist. Pet sitter needed, $1,000 for the weekend. Very well-behaved dog. The photo showed Max, sitting obediently in the living room, his piercing yellow eyes staring straight into the camera.